Welcome to the Classic Books Reimagined channel. This is part 4 of the audiobook Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is the second novel by English author Jane Austen, originally published in 1813. It is a novel of manners that follows the character development of Elizabeth Bennet, the protagonist who learns about the repercussions of hasty judgments and comes to appreciate the difference between superficial goodness and actual goodness. It has become one of the most popular novels in English literature, with over 20 million copies sold, and has inspired many derivatives in modern literature. In this audiobook, the original Pride and Prejudice has been reimagined as if it had been originally written by best-selling New York Times and USA Today author Carole Brown. Carole Brown has written more than 100 novels and 8 novellas and contributed to multiple anthologies, selling more than 6 million copies. We hope you enjoy this classic book, Reimagined. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and tell us what you like about this reimagined book, or what you think we need to do better next time. Thanks for watching and listening.
Chapter 41: Farewells and New Beginnings. The first week after their return flew by, and the second week began, marking the regiment's last days in Meryton. The young ladies in the neighbourhood were downcast, their spirits as gloomy as a rainy day. Only the elder Miss Bennet seemed unaffected, continuing with their usual activities, much to the annoyance of Kitty and Lydia, who couldn't understand how anyone could be so heartless. "Heavens, what will become of us?" they would wail. "How can you be smiling, Lizzie?" Their affectionate mother shared their sorrow, reminiscing about her own heartbreak when Colonel Miller's regiment had left 25 years ago. "I cried for 2 days straight when they left. Thought I'd break my heart," she sighed. "I'm sure I'll break mine," Lydia lamented. "If only we could go to Brighton," Mrs. Bennet mused. "Yes, if only. But Papa is so disagreeable," Lydia agreed. "A little sea bathing would set me up forever," Mrs. Bennet added. "Aunt Philip says it would do me a world of good," Kitty chimed in. Elizabeth tried to find amusement in their constant lamentations, but shame overshadowed any sense of humour. She couldn't help but see the truth in Mr. Darcy's objections, and felt a new sympathy for his interference in his friend's affairs. However, Lydia's gloom was soon dispelled by an invitation from Mrs. Forster, the Colonel's wife, to accompany her to Brighton. Lydia's rapture knew no bounds, and Mrs. Bennet's delight matched it, while Kitty's disappointment was palpable. "I don't see why Mrs. Forster didn't ask me too," Kitty grumbled. "I'm 2 years older than Lydia and have just as much right to be invited." Elizabeth and Jane tried to soothe Kitty, but their efforts were in vain. As for Elizabeth, she saw Lydia's invitation as a potential disaster and secretly advised her father against letting Lydia go. "Lydia will never be content until she exposes herself publicly. We can never expect her to do it with so little expense or inconvenience as under the present circumstances," Mr. Bennet replied, after listening to Elizabeth's concerns. "Do you realize the damage to our family's reputation from Lydia's behaviour? This could ruin us," Elizabeth implored. "Ruin us? Have any of your suitors been scared off by Lydia's antics? If they can't handle a little absurdity, they're not worth your time," Mr. Bennet responded with a dismissive chuckle. "We'll never have peace if Lydia doesn't go. Colonel Forster will keep her out of trouble, and she's too poor to attract any fortune hunters. Maybe this trip will teach her some humility." Elizabeth left the conversation disappointed, but knew she had done her duty. She refused to dwell on it, confident she had spoken up for the right reasons. If Lydia and Mrs. Bennet had known about her conversation with Mr. Bennet, their indignation would have been boundless. In Lydia's eyes, a visit to Brighton was the epitome of happiness. She imagined herself surrounded by officers, the centre of attention, and indulging in all the excitement of a military camp. Elizabeth was now to see Mr. Wickham for the last time. She had seen him frequently since her return, and any agitation she once felt for him had dissipated. His renewed attentions only irritated her, and she found his previously charming demeanour now appeared affected and tiresome. On the last day of the regiment's stay, Wickham dined at Longbourn. Elizabeth was in no mood to part on good terms. When he inquired about her time at Hunsford, she mentioned Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy's visit to Rosings, noting Wickham's surprise and discomfort. "How long were they at Rosings?" he asked. "Nearly 3 weeks," Elizabeth replied. "And you saw them often?" "Yes, almost every day." "His manners are very different from his cousin's," Wickham commented. "Yes, very different. But I think Mr. Darcy improves upon acquaintance," Elizabeth said. Wickham's expression was a mix of surprise and suspicion. "Indeed? And may I ask, has he improved in manners?" "Oh, no. In essentials, I believe he's very much the same as ever," Elizabeth responded. Wickham seemed unsure whether to be relieved or distrustful. "I'm glad he at least appears to do what is right," he said. "But I fear this behaviour is just for show when he's around his aunt, who he fears. His real aim is to win Miss de Bourgh." Elizabeth couldn't help but smile at this, but she chose not to engage further. Wickham's attempt to rekindle his grievances with Darcy didn't interest her. They parted with mutual civility and perhaps a shared desire never to meet again. That night, Lydia left for Meryton with Mrs. Forster to set out for Brighton the next morning. The farewell was noisy rather than sentimental, with Kitty shedding tears of envy. Mrs. Bennet was full of good wishes for Lydia, encouraging her to enjoy herself, advice Lydia eagerly embraced. Amid Lydia's loud farewells, her sister's more subdued goodbyes went unheard. Elizabeth's relief at Wickham's departure was immense. She had seen through his charm and was grateful to be rid of his attentions. Her reflections on the recent events left her determined to move forward with a clearer understanding of those around her and a renewed commitment to her own principles. Chapter 42. The Tides of Disappointment. Elizabeth Bennet's views on marriage and domestic bliss were shadowed by her own family's example. Her father, once enchanted by her mother's youthful beauty, had quickly found that charm alone did not sustain affection. Mr. Bennet's retreat into his books and his dry humour were his only solace against his wife's simpler mind and lack of understanding, leaving their home often devoid of true marital harmony. Elizabeth, painfully aware of her parents' mismatch, often pondered the effect their union had on her family's reputation and her sister's prospects. Despite her attempts to disregard the discomforting realities at home, the truth that such a union should not be a model for her own future partnerships was undeniable. Her reflections were interrupted by the departure of the regiment from Meryton, an event she had thought would bring her peace. Instead, it left her to deal with the doldrums of a household sunk in ennui, her mother and youngest sisters bemoaning the lack of social excitement. Although Kitty might eventually find her sense again without the soldiers' attention, Lydia's absence at Brighton, filled with the dual temptations of a seaside resort and a military camp, only promised further folly. The long-anticipated removal of the regiment had not brought the relief Elizabeth had hoped for. Instead, she found herself looking forward to her upcoming trip to the lakes as a welcome escape from the discontent at Longbourn. Yet, even this plan was marred by Jane's inability to accompany her, adding a tinge of regret to her anticipation. "If only Jane could come, it would be perfect," Elizabeth mused, recognizing the irony that complete contentment in plans often led to disappointment. A little vexation spices the pleasure and saves us from disillusionment. Amidst these reflections, a letter from Mrs. Gardiner arrived, altering their travel plans. Business would delay Mr. Gardiner, truncating their grand tour to merely a visit to Derbyshire. Though disappointed, Elizabeth tried to make the best of the change. Derbyshire sparked a new kind of excitement, as it was the county of Mr. Darcy's Pemberley. As the visit to Pemberley was proposed, Elizabeth wrestled with her conflicting emotions. The idea thrilled her with an uneasy mixture of anticipation and dread. Visiting his estate could be overwhelming, yet how can I deny the allure of those celebrated grounds? Despite her reservations, curiosity won out. When she confirmed that the Darcys were not in residence, her fears were somewhat allayed, and she allowed herself to look forward to exploring Pemberley. The potential for unexpected encounters lingered in her mind, casting a shadow of excitement and apprehension over the visit. As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth felt a complex mix of eagerness and anxiety. This trip to Derbyshire was not just a diversion, but a journey towards understanding her own feelings, a journey that might just lead her through the very heart of Mr. Darcy's world. Chapter 43. A Change of Heart. Elizabeth's heart raced as they drove through the lush landscape, eagerly anticipating her first glimpse of Pemberley Woods. When the carriage turned into the lodge, her nerves fluttered with excitement and trepidation. The vast park unfolded before her, a tapestry of natural beauty with rolling hills and dense woods. The scene was so picturesque, it took her breath away. As they ascended a gentle hill, Pemberley House came into view. The grand stone mansion stood proud on the rising ground, framed by a backdrop of wooded hills and a river that flowed serenely in front of it. Elizabeth marvelled at the estate's natural elegance, untouched by any artificial enhancements. Her admiration was shared by her companions, and in that moment she entertained a fleeting thought. Being the mistress of Pemberley might not be so bad after all. They crossed a charming bridge and arrived at the entrance of the house. Elizabeth's anticipation grew as they were shown into the grand hall. The housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, greeted them warmly and led them on a tour of the magnificent rooms. Elizabeth found herself enchanted by the tasteful decor and the breathtaking views from every window. And to think, she mused, I could have been mistress of all this. But she quickly reminded herself that such a role would have come at the cost of losing her beloved uncle and aunt. This realization saved her from lingering regret. Her curiosity piqued. Elizabeth longed to ask about Mr. Darcy's whereabouts, but lacked the nerve. Fortunately, her uncle asked the question for her. Mrs. Reynolds informed them that Mr. Darcy was expected the next day with a large party of friends. Elizabeth was relieved that their visit hadn't coincided with his arrival. As they admired a series of miniatures in one of the rooms, Elizabeth's aunt pointed out a portrait of Mr. Wickham. Mrs. Reynolds mentioned his troubled past, noting he had been a ward of Mr. Darcy's father, but had turned out wild. Elizabeth felt a pang of discomfort, but said nothing. Then Mrs. Reynolds pointed to another portrait, this one of Mr. Darcy himself. I've heard much about your master's fine appearance, Mrs. Gardiner said, glancing at Elizabeth. Lizzie, what do you think? Is it a good likeness? Elizabeth blushed and admitted it was. Mrs. Reynolds, noticing Elizabeth's familiarity with Mr. Darcy, became even more respectful. Does the young lady know Mr. Darcy? She asked. A little, Elizabeth replied. And don't you think he is very handsome? Mrs. Reynolds continued. Yes, very handsome, Elizabeth agreed, feeling her cheeks warm. Mrs. Reynolds then led them to a larger portrait of Mr. Darcy, painted years ago. As Elizabeth gazed at it, she felt a softening in her heart. The housekeeper's praises painted a picture of a man much kinder and more generous than she had imagined. It conflicted sharply with her previous impressions, stirring confusion and curiosity within her. After the tour, they headed back downstairs and met the gardener, who took them across the lawn towards the river. Elizabeth glanced back at the house, lost in thought, when suddenly Mr. Darcy himself appeared. Their eyes met, and both blushed deeply. He approached Elizabeth with unexpected civility, inquiring about her family with an ease that surprised her. Their brief conversation left Elizabeth bewildered. Mr. Darcy's manner was so different from their last encounter at Rosings. He was polite, even gentle, a stark contrast to his previous demeanour. Elizabeth couldn't fathom the change, but it intrigued her deeply. As they walked through the beautiful grounds, Elizabeth's mind whirled with questions. What had caused this transformation in Mr. Darcy? Could it be that her words at Hunsford had truly impacted him? She couldn't be sure, but she found herself hoping it might be so. Their walk continued, leading them to a picturesque glen where they crossed a simple bridge. Elizabeth longed to explore further, but had to turn back when Mrs. Gardiner grew tired. As they retraced their steps, Mr. Gardiner, engrossed in a conversation about fishing with the gardener, slowed their pace. Just then, Mr. Darcy appeared again. Elizabeth, slightly more composed this time, greeted him. They spoke of the beauty of Pemberley, but Elizabeth quickly faltered, fearing her praise might be misinterpreted. To her surprise, Mr. Darcy asked to be introduced to her relatives. Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph as she introduced her aunt and uncle. Mr. Darcy's graciousness and genuine interest in their conversation filled her with pride. As they walked, Mr. Darcy invited Mr. Gardiner to fish at Pemberley, offering equipment and advice on the best spots. Mrs. Gardiner exchanged a look of amazement with Elizabeth, who was equally astonished. The civility and kindness Mr. Darcy displayed were unlike anything she had expected. When the conversation shifted to Miss Darcy, Mr. Darcy expressed a wish to introduce his sister to Elizabeth. The request took her by surprise, but she agreed. It was a gesture of high regard, and it flattered Elizabeth immensely. Their walk ended at the carriage, where Mr. Darcy bid them farewell with utmost politeness. As they drove away, Elizabeth's aunt and uncle couldn't stop praising him. Elizabeth, lost in her thoughts, felt a mix of emotions. Mr. Darcy's unexpected kindness and the prospect of meeting his sister left her with much to ponder. For the rest of the day, Elizabeth could think of little else. Mr. Darcy's transformation, his evident desire to connect with her, and his invitation to meet his sister weighed heavily on her mind. The complexity of her feelings towards him grew, blending curiosity with a newfound respect. She could not deny that Mr. Darcy, in this new light, was a man worth knowing better. Chapter 44. Unexpected Pleasantries at Lambton. Elizabeth had half convinced herself that Mr. Darcy would bring his sister to see her the day after her arrival at Pemberley. Thus, she decided to stay close to the inn that morning, unwilling to miss their visit. However, her expectations proved premature, as the anticipated guests arrived unexpectedly that very morning. They had just returned from a stroll around Lambton, and were about to dress for a luncheon engagement when the rumble of a carriage drew their attention. Peering out, Elizabeth instantly recognized the liveried curricle approaching, and hastily shared her surprise with her aunt and uncle, revealing the honour she anticipated. The Gardiners were taken aback, piecing together Elizabeth's recent interactions with Mr. Darcy, and speculating about his possible partiality toward their niece. Amidst this flurry of speculation, Elizabeth felt a wave of nervousness. She worried that Mr. Darcy's favourable opinion might have overly influenced his sister's expectations. Concerned about meeting these perceived expectations, and anxious not to disappoint, she retreated from the window to collect her thoughts. When Miss Darcy and her brother arrived, Elizabeth was struck by the young woman's reserved nature, a stark contrast to the proud demeanour she had been led to expect. Miss Darcy was exceedingly shy, rather than aloof, speaking little and seeming as overwhelmed as Elizabeth felt. The visit took an even more surprising turn when Mr. Darcy mentioned that Mr. Bingley was also soon to arrive. Elizabeth barely had time to process this information when Bingley himself appeared, his familiar, cheerful demeanour instantly warming the room. He greeted Elizabeth with genuine enthusiasm, inquiring about her family with his usual affable charm. The reunion sparked a lively interest among the Gardiners, who keenly observed the interactions, particularly between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth. It was clear to them that Mr. Darcy held a deep admiration for Elizabeth, though her own feelings seemed less decipherable. During the visit, Elizabeth found herself trying to discern the sentiments of each guest, hoping to reassure herself of their opinions while managing her own reactions. Her task was made somewhat easier by the evident efforts of her visitors to be agreeable. Bingley was engaging, Miss Darcy earnest, and Mr. Darcy particularly determined to please. As conversation flowed, Elizabeth's thoughts often drifted to Jane, especially when interacting with Bingley. She hoped his inquiries hinted at a sustained affection. However, any potential rivalry between Miss Darcy and Jane seemed unfounded, as Bingley's behaviour towards Miss Darcy lacked any particular warmth or preference. Before their departure, Mr. Darcy and his sister extended an invitation to dine at Pemberley, which Elizabeth accepted despite her initial hesitation, influenced by her aunt's encouragement and Mr. Gardiner's sociable nature. After their guests left, Elizabeth reflected on the visit with a mixture of satisfaction and contemplation. The once stark image of Mr. Darcy had softened greatly in her eyes, transformed by his uncharacteristic civility and apparent sincerity. His efforts to engage not only her, but also her relatives, spoke volumes, suggesting a depth of feeling that Elizabeth could not ignore. As she prepared for the upcoming visit to Pemberley, Elizabeth's anticipation was tinged with both curiosity and a budding respect for Mr. Darcy, whose recent displays of kindness and affection were reshaping her understanding of him and her own feelings. Chapter 45. Under Watchful Eyes. Elizabeth was now convinced that Miss Bingley's dislike stemmed from jealousy, and she couldn't help but wonder how her appearance at Pemberley would be received. As they reached the house, they were led through the hall into a delightful summer saloon, its northern windows offering a refreshing view of high, wooded hills and a picturesque lawn dotted with oaks and Spanish chestnuts. Inside, they were greeted by Miss Darcy, who was sitting with Mrs. Hurst, Miss Bingley, and another lady from London. Georgiana's reception was polite, but laced with shyness and nervousness, which might have come across as pride to anyone who didn't know better. Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth, however, understood and felt sympathy for her. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley barely acknowledged them with a curt nod. An awkward silence ensued until Mrs. Annesley, a gracious and genteel woman, broke it by initiating a conversation. Between her, Mrs. Gardiner, and Elizabeth, the dialogue flowed smoothly, though Georgiana contributed timidly, clearly wanting to join in more actively, but lacking the courage. Elizabeth noticed Miss Bingley watching her closely, especially when she spoke to Georgiana. This scrutiny didn't stop Elizabeth from trying to engage with Miss Darcy, but the distance between them made it difficult. She found herself both hoping and dreading Mr. Darcy's arrival, unsure which feeling was stronger. After about 15 minutes, Miss Bingley finally broke her silence with a cold inquiry about Elizabeth's family. Elizabeth responded with equal indifference, and the conversation lapsed again. The arrival of servants with an array of cold meats, cake, and the finest fruits of the season provided a welcome distraction. As they gathered around the table, Elizabeth's conflicting feelings about Mr. Darcy's possible appearance were resolved when he entered the room. Mr. Darcy's entrance caused a stir. Elizabeth decided to remain composed, knowing all eyes were on them. Miss Bingley's forced smiles and continued attentions to Mr. Darcy were laced with jealousy. Miss Darcy, encouraged by her brother's presence, made more effort to engage in conversation, and Elizabeth saw how much Mr. Darcy wanted them to get along. Miss Bingley, unable to contain her irritation, seized the first opportunity to make a snide remark. "Pray, Miss Eliza, are not the Shire militia removed from Meryton? They must be a great loss to your family." Though she avoided mentioning Wickham directly, Elizabeth understood the underlying reference and felt a pang of distress. She quickly regained her composure and answered calmly, noting Darcy's heightened colour and Georgiana's discomfort. Miss Bingley had hoped to unsettle Elizabeth, but her plan backfired. Elizabeth's composed response quieted the room, and Miss Darcy, regaining her confidence, remained silent but attentive. Mr. Darcy, whose eyes she feared to meet, seemed to appreciate Elizabeth's handling of the situation. After the awkward exchange, the visit continued briefly. Mr. Darcy escorted them to their carriage, while Miss Bingley vented her frustrations by criticising Elizabeth's appearance. Georgiana, loyal to her brother, refrained from joining in. Upon returning to the saloon, Miss Bingley couldn't resist another jab. "How very ill Eliza Bennet looks this morning, Mr. Darcy. I never saw anyone so altered. She has grown so brown and coarse." Mr. Darcy, though displeased, replied coolly, "I perceive no other alteration than her being slightly tanned, a natural consequence of travelling in the summer." Miss Bingley persisted. "I never could see any beauty in her. Her features are not handsome, and her eyes have a sharp, shrewish look. Her air is self-sufficient and unfashionable." Convinced that Mr. Darcy admired Elizabeth, Miss Bingley believed her disparaging remarks would unsettle him. Instead, they provoked him to finally speak his mind. "When I first knew her, I considered her rather pretty," he admitted, "but it has been many months since I have regarded her as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance." His declaration left Miss Bingley stunned and silenced. On the carriage ride back, Mrs. Gardiner and Elizabeth discussed everything but the person who occupied their thoughts the most. They spoke of the house, Georgiana, and the fruit, but avoided the subject of Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth was dying to know her aunt's thoughts on him, while Mrs. Gardiner hoped Elizabeth would bring him up first. The day's events left Elizabeth with much to ponder. Mr. Darcy's civility and the prospect of meeting his sister were significant. As she reflected on the day's visit, she couldn't help but feel a deeper curiosity and a grudging admiration for the man she had once dismissed so completely. Chapter 46. Turmoil at Lambton. Elizabeth had harboured a quiet hope of finding a letter from Jane upon arriving at Lambton, but her anticipation turned to disappointment, as no such letter awaited her. For 3 mornings she faced the same letdown, until the 4th day brought not just 1, but 2 letters from her sister, one of which had been misdirected and delayed. Elizabeth was not taken aback by the misdirection, given Jane's notoriously messy handwriting. As she prepared for a morning walk, her aunt and uncle excused themselves, allowing her to absorb the contents of Jane's letters in solitude. The first letter, somewhat faded and crumpled, started with trivial news of local engagements and social outings. However, as Elizabeth read on, the tone shifted dramatically. Jane's words became hurried, the script tight with urgency. "Since writing the above, dearest Lizzie," Jane had penned, "something alarming has occurred. I hesitate to tell you for fear of your reaction, but it concerns Lydia. Last night an express arrived from Colonel Forster announcing that Lydia has eloped to Scotland with Mr. Wickham." Elizabeth's heart sank. The room seemed to spin as she absorbed the shock of her younger sister's reckless action. Jane's letter detailed the collective astonishment and dismay of their family, her own disbelief tempered by a desperate hope for the best. But the reality was stark. Lydia had acted imprudently, entangled with a man they all had misjudged. Pressing on to the second letter, Elizabeth found Jane's handwriting almost illegible with distress. The follow-up was even more troubling. Lydia and Wickham might not have married as they fled to Scotland, raising fears of a scandal that could tarnish the entire Bennet family. Colonel Forster had traced them as far as London, but there the trail went cold. Overwhelmed, Elizabeth barely registered the sound of footsteps approaching. It was Mr. Darcy entering the room. Her distress was palpable, her expression one of sheer desperation as she exclaimed the need to find her uncle, to act immediately on this family crisis. Mr. Darcy's reaction was immediate concern. "What is the matter?" he asked, his usual reserve overtaken by a more pressing personal urgency. "I must find Mr. Gardiner at once," Elizabeth blurted out, her voice trembling. "It's Lydia. She has eloped with Mr. Wickham." The gravity of the situation struck Darcy visibly. He offered to fetch her relatives himself, insisting she was too shaken to go. Despite her protests, her physical state betrayed her. She was on the verge of collapse. Once alone again, Elizabeth tried to compose herself, but the enormity of Lydia's folly overwhelmed her. When Darcy returned, his face etched with concern, Elizabeth could no longer contain her emotions and broke down in tears. Darcy listened in silent agony as Elizabeth recounted the full extent of the scandal threatening her family. His expression was one of deep sympathy mixed with disbelief. The man he had warned her about had now possibly ruined her sister's reputation, and the repercussions were unimaginable. After offering what comfort he could, Darcy reluctantly excused himself, his own distress evident. He promised to keep their planned engagement at Pemberley discreetly cancelled under the guise of urgent business. Elizabeth watched him go, her heart heavy with a tumult of emotions, regret for not acting on her earlier suspicions about Wickham, gratitude for Darcy's kindness, and a dawning realization of her deepening feelings for him amidst the crisis. As her aunt and uncle rushed back, alarmed by the servant's message, Elizabeth explained the situation. The Gardiners were quick to offer their support, ready to leave at a moment's notice to assist in any way. In the chaos that ensued, plans were hastily made. They would depart for Longbourn immediately, abandoning their stay at Lambton and any lingering hopes of a peaceful resolution at Pemberley. Amidst the hurried preparations, Elizabeth felt a profound despair, not just for Lydia's predicament, but for the personal revelations that had come at such a cost. As the carriage pulled away, heading back to her family home, Elizabeth sat grappling with the weight of what had transpired, her mind a whirl of worry and wistful thoughts of what might have been with Mr. Darcy. Chapter 47. Pondering the worst, hoping for the best. As they drove away from the town, Elizabeth's uncle broke the silence. "I've been thinking it over again, Elizabeth," he said thoughtfully, "and really, upon serious consideration, I'm leaning more towards your eldest sister's opinion. It seems unlikely that any young man would target a girl who's not unprotected or friendless, especially while staying with his colonel's family. It's hard to imagine he thought her friends wouldn't step in, or that the regiment wouldn't take action against him. The risk just doesn't match the temptation." Elizabeth's face brightened for a moment. "Do you really think so?" she asked hopefully. "I'm starting to agree with your uncle," Mrs. Gardiner added. "It's too big a violation of decency and honour for Wickham to be guilty of it. Lizzie, can you really believe him capable of this?" Elizabeth sighed. "Maybe not neglecting his own interest, but everything else? Yes, I can believe that. If he had planned to marry her, why wouldn't they have gone straight to Scotland?" "There's no absolute proof they didn't go to Scotland," Mr. Gardiner replied, "and their switch from the chaise to a hackney coach doesn't necessarily mean anything. Besides, no trace of them was found on the Barnet Road." "Well, assuming they're in London, they might be hiding for some reason other than eloping. Money might be tight, and they could think it cheaper to marry in London." "But why all the secrecy? Why fear detection? Why hide their marriage? No, this isn't likely. His closest friend didn't believe he intended to marry her. Wickham will never marry without money. Lydia has no claims or attractions beyond youth and good humour that would make him give up his chance of marrying well. As for the disgrace in the regiment, I can't say what effect that would have. But knowing my father's indolence and lack of attention to family matters, Wickham might think he wouldn't do much." "But do you think Lydia is so lost to everything but love that she'd agree to live with him without marriage?" "It's shocking," Elizabeth admitted, tears in her eyes. "But she's young and has never been taught to think seriously. She's been focused on nothing but amusement and vanity. She's been free to dispose of her time idly and adopt any opinion. Since the show were quartered in Meryton, her head has been full of love, flirtation, and officers. And we know Wickham is charming enough to captivate a woman." "But Jane doesn't think so badly of Wickham," Mrs. Gardiner pointed out. "Jane never thinks ill of anyone. She wouldn't believe someone capable of such an attempt until it's proven. But she knows, as I do, that Wickham is profligate and deceitful." Mrs. Gardiner's curiosity was piqued. "Do you really know all this?" she asked. Elizabeth coloured slightly. "I do. I told you about his behaviour towards Mr. Darcy, and you heard him speak ill of Darcy yourself. There are other circumstances I can't share, but his lies about the Pemberley family are endless. He painted Miss Darcy as proud and disagreeable, yet she's amiable and unpretentious." "But does Lydia know nothing of this?" Mrs. Gardiner asked. "No, and that's the worst part. I didn't know the truth myself until I was in Kent. When I returned, the shear was set to leave Meryton soon, so Jane and I didn't think it necessary to make our knowledge public. We didn't see the need to ruin Wickham's reputation. Even when Lydia went with Mrs. Forster, it never occurred to us she was in danger. The idea never crossed my mind." "So, when they went to Brighton, you had no reason to believe they were fond of each other?" "None. I can't recall any signs of affection. When he first arrived, Lydia admired him, as did every girl in Meryton. But he never gave her special attention. Her initial fascination wore off, and others in the regiment became her favourites. Though their fears, hopes, and speculations offered little novelty, the topic occupied them throughout the journey. Elizabeth's thoughts were consumed with self-reproach and worry, allowing no respite. They travelled quickly and arrived at Longbourn by dinner-time the next day. The sight of the little gardeners capering with joy at their arrival was a welcome distraction. Elizabeth jumped out, kissed them quickly, and hurried inside to find Jane. They embraced, tears in their eyes, and Elizabeth wasted no time asking if there was any news. "Not yet," Jane replied, "but now that Uncle is here, I hope everything will be well." "Is Father in town?" "Yes, he went on Tuesday, as I wrote to you. We've only heard from him once. He wrote a few lines on Wednesday to say he arrived safely and to give me his directions, which I had asked for. He added he wouldn't write again unless there was important news." "And Mother, how is she? How are you all?" "Mother is tolerable, though her spirits are shaken. She's upstairs and will be glad to see you. Mary and Kitty are well." "And you, Jane? You look pale. You must have been through so much." Jane assured her she was well, and their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner with their children. Jane welcomed and thanked them with smiles and tears. In the drawing room, the same questions were repeated, but Jane had no new information. Mrs. Bennet received them with tears, lamentations, and invectives against Wickham. She blamed everyone except herself for Lydia's situation. "If I had taken the family to Brighton, this wouldn't have happened. Poor Lydia had no one to watch over her. Why did the Forsters let her out of their sight? I always thought they were unfit to have her. Now Mr. Bennet will fight Wickham and be killed, and will be turned out by the Collinses. Brother, if you don't help us, I don't know what we'll do." They all tried to calm her, and Mr. Gardiner promised to go to London the next day to help Mr. Bennet. "Don't give in to useless alarm," he said. "It's right to prepare for the worst, but don't assume it's certain. It's not been a week since they left Brighton. We may still hear good news. I'll find my brother and bring him to Gracechurch Street, and we'll figure out what to do." Mrs. Bennet was slightly appeased. "Oh, brother, please find them. If they're not married, make them marry. Tell Lydia she can have as much money as she needs for clothes after they're married. And keep Mr. Bennet from fighting. Tell him I'm frightened out of my wits and can't rest day or night. Tell Lydia not to choose her clothes until she sees me, for she doesn't know the best warehouses. Oh, brother, you're so kind." Mr. Gardiner assured her of his efforts, but urged her to moderate her hopes and fears. They left her to her emotions and joined Mary and Kitty in the dining room. Mary was calm, though more fretful than usual. She whispered to Elizabeth, "This is unfortunate and will be much talked of, but we must support each other. This teaches us that a woman's reputation is fragile and must be guarded." Elizabeth, overwhelmed, made no reply. Mary continued to console herself with moral reflections. In the afternoon, Elizabeth and Jane found a moment alone. Elizabeth eagerly inquired about everything. Jane explained Colonel Forster's shock and concern, and how he had suspected some partiality on Lydia's side, but nothing alarming. He had hurried to Longbourn when the news broke. "And Denny?" Elizabeth asked. "Did he know of their plans?" Denny denied knowing anything specific. He wouldn't repeat his earlier persuasion that they weren't marrying. I hope he was misunderstood. "Until Colonel Forster came, you all thought they were married?" "Yes. I felt uneasy about Lydia's happiness with him, knowing his conduct. Father and Mother only saw the imprudence. Kitty admitted Lydia had hinted at something in a letter." "But not before Brighton?" "No." "Does Colonel Forster know Wickham's character?" "He spoke less well of him than before, calling him imprudent and extravagant. Since this affair, it's said he left Meryton in debt, but I hope that's false." "Oh, Jane, if we had exposed him sooner, this might not have happened." "Maybe, but it seemed unjust to reveal his past without knowing his present feelings. We acted with good intentions." Jane showed Elizabeth Lydia's letter to Mrs. Forster, full of reckless glee and plans to elope, laughing at the shock it would cause. Elizabeth exclaimed, "Thoughtless Lydia! At least she intended to marry. Whatever he persuaded her to later, her initial aim wasn't infamy. Father must be devastated. He was speechless for 10 minutes. Mother was hysterical, and the house was in chaos. Did everyone know by the end of the day? I hope not, but it was hard to keep quiet. Mother's hysterics and my own shock hindered me, but Aunt Phillips and Lady Lucas have been kind and supportive. Elizabeth was grateful, but also annoyed by neighbours' intrusions during such a private ordeal. She asked about their father's plans in London. Jane explained his search for clues from postilions and coachmen, hoping to trace the hackney coach. As they pieced together the events, Elizabeth felt a mix of hope and dread. The journey was full of anxiety, but the reunion at Longbourn, though overshadowed by their troubles, brought some comfort. Elizabeth was determined to face whatever came next with strength and resolve. Chapter 48. Waiting for Word. The entire family held a tense vigil for a letter from Mr. Bennet the following morning, but disappointment hung heavy in the air as the post arrived empty-handed. Under normal circumstances, Mr. Bennet's correspondence habits were lax, but the seriousness of the current situation had everyone hoping for his uncharacteristic promptness. Their only conclusion was that he had no good news to share, though they would have welcomed any certainty at that point. Mr. Gardiner had postponed his departure just for this, hoping for some word before he left. When no letter came, the family at least found solace in knowing they would receive regular updates once he reached London. As he left, he assured them he would urge Mr. Bennet to return to Longbourn as soon as possible, much to Mrs. Bennet's relief, who feared for her husband's safety amidst the chaos of London, possibly challenging Wickham to a duel. Mrs. Gardiner decided to extend her stay, thinking her presence might offer some comfort to her nieces. She, along with the other aunt, spent her days bolstering the spirits of her nieces, although her attempts were often undercut by her own grim updates on Wickham's character, leaving the atmosphere even more sombre than before. Meryton was abuzz with gossip, painting Wickham as a villain who had deceived them all. Once considered a charming young man, he was now blamed for debts and dishonourable acts throughout the town. Elizabeth, sceptical of the wildest rumours, still found her fears about Lydia's situation confirmed in the quieter moments of reflection. Jane, ever the optimist, clung to hope but found it waning with each passing day, especially now that the possibility of a Scottish marriage seemed increasingly slim. Tuesday brought a letter from Mr. Gardiner. He had found Mr. Bennet and convinced him to stay with him in Gracechurch Street after unsuccessful attempts to trace Lydia and Wickham in Epsom and Clapham. Mr. Gardiner's letter didn't hold much hope for discovering Lydia's whereabouts, but he planned to inquire at London's principal hotels, a strategy more out of desperation than expectation. Mr. Bennet's disinclination to leave London without resolution was evident, and he promised to write soon with any news. Mr. Gardiner also sought help from Colonel Forster, hoping someone in Wickham's regiment might know of his current whereabouts or associates. Each day was a trial for the Bennets, filled with anxious waiting for the postman. When the letters did arrive, they opened them with trembling hands, dreading the news they might bring. Amidst these tense days, an unexpected letter arrived from Mr. Collins, offering his condolences in a manner only he could, pompously and with little real comfort. He lamented the stain on the family's honour and warned of the social consequences, suggesting they disown Lydia to preserve what little dignity they could. The letter from Mr. Collins was met with mixed emotions, a blend of irritation at his officious tone and amusement at his dramatic expressions of sympathy. As they navigated these trying times, the strength of family bonds was tested, and Elizabeth found herself grappling not only with her sister's scandal, but also with her complex feelings about Mr. Darcy, whose recent actions had shown him in a new light. Each day without news from him added to her turmoil, leaving her to wonder about the future of not just her family, but her own heart as well. Chapter 49. Surprising News. 2 days after Mr. Bennet returned home, Jane and Elizabeth were strolling through the shrubbery behind the house when they noticed the housekeeper, Mrs. Hill, hurrying towards them. Assuming she had come to fetch them for their mother, they walked towards her, but Mrs. Hill's expression was one of surprise. "Begging your pardon, madam," Mrs. Hill said, addressing Jane, "but I was hoping you might have heard some good news from town, so I took the liberty of coming to ask." "What do you mean, Hill? We've heard nothing from town," Jane replied. "Dear madam," Mrs. Hill exclaimed, clearly astonished, "don't you know there's been an express delivery for master from Mr. Gardiner? He's had a letter this past half-hour." The girls wasted no time, running through the vestibule into the breakfast room and then the library, but their father was nowhere to be found. They were about to head upstairs when the butler informed them that Mr. Bennet was walking towards the little copse. Jane soon lagged behind as Elizabeth, breathless but determined, caught up with her father. "Oh, Papa, what news? Have you heard from my uncle?" Elizabeth asked eagerly. "Yes, I've had a letter from him by express," Mr. Bennet replied. "Well, and what news does it bring, good or bad?" "What good can we expect?" he said, pulling the letter from his pocket. "But perhaps you'd like to read it." Elizabeth grabbed the letter from his hand as Jane finally caught up. "Read it aloud," their father said. "I hardly know what it's about myself." Elizabeth began to read. Gracechurch Street, Monday, August 2nd. My dear brother, at last, I am able to send you some news of my niece, and such as, upon the whole, I hope will give you satisfaction. Soon after you left me on Saturday, I was fortunate enough to find out where they were in London. I'll save the details for when we meet, but it's enough to know they are found. I have seen them both. "They're married!" cried Jane, her face lighting up with hope. Elizabeth continued reading. "They are not married, nor was there any intention of being so. However, if you are willing to perform the engagements I've made on your behalf, I hope it won't be long before they are. All that's required is for you to assure your daughter, by settlement, her equal share of the £5,000 set aside for your children after your and my sister's passing, and to allow her £100 per annum during your lifetime. Considering everything, I had no hesitation in agreeing to these terms on your behalf. I'm sending this by express to avoid any delay. From these particulars, you'll see that Mr. Wickham's circumstances aren't as hopeless as believed. I'm happy to say there will be some money left, even after his debts are paid, to settle on my niece. If you give me full authority to act in your name, I'll direct Haggerston to prepare the proper settlement. There's no need for you to come to town. Stay at Longbourn and rely on my diligence. Send your answer as soon as possible and write explicitly. We've decided it's best for my niece to be married from our house, which I hope you'll approve of. She comes to us today. I'll write again as soon as anything more is determined. Yours, etc., E.D.W. Gardiner. "Is it possible?" cried Elizabeth. "Will he really marry her?" "Wickham isn't as undeserving as we thought," said Jane. "My dear father, I congratulate you." "Have you answered the letter?" Elizabeth asked. "No, but it must be done soon," Mr. Bennet replied. "Please, Papa, don't waste any time," Elizabeth urged. "Consider how important every moment is in this situation." "I'll write for you if you don't want to," Jane offered. "I dislike it very much," he admitted, "but it must be done." With that, he turned back towards the house. "And may I ask about the terms?" Elizabeth hesitated. "Complied with. I'm ashamed he asked so little," Mr. Bennet replied. "And they must marry, though he is such a man," Elizabeth muttered. "Yes, they must marry. There's no other option. But I want to know two things. How much money your uncle laid down to make it happen, and how I'll ever repay him." "Money? What do you mean, sir?" Jane asked, confused. "No man in his right mind would marry Lydia for just £100 a year while I'm alive and 50 after I'm gone," he explained. "That's true," Elizabeth said. "I hadn't thought of that. His debts must be considerable. Our uncle is so generous. I hope he hasn't put himself in distress. A small sum couldn't cover all this." "Wickham's a fool if he takes her for less than £10,000, Mr. Bennet replied. "I'd hate to think so poorly of him at the start of our relationship." £10,000! How will we ever repay that?" Elizabeth cried. Mr. Bennet made no answer, and they walked in silence until they reached the house. Mr. Bennet went to the library to write, and the girls went to the breakfast room. "They're really getting married," Elizabeth said, once they were alone. "It's strange to be thankful for such a marriage, given how unhappy it will likely be. Oh, Lydia!" "I comfort myself thinking that Wickham wouldn't marry Lydia if he didn't care for her," Jane said. "I can't believe our uncle advanced £10,000. He has children of his own to think of." "If we find out Wickham's debts and how much is settled on Lydia, we'll know what our uncle did," Elizabeth said. "Our uncle and aunt's kindness can never be repaid. Taking her in and offering protection is such a sacrifice. She must be with them now. If this goodness doesn't change her, she'll never deserve happiness." "We must forget what's past," Jane said. "I hope they'll be happy. His agreeing to marry her shows he's come to his senses. Their mutual affection will steady them. I hope they live quietly and rationally, so their past mistakes will be forgotten." "Their actions are unforgettable," Elizabeth replied. "It's useless to talk about it." Realizing their mother probably didn't know what had happened, they went to their father and asked if they should tell her. "Do as you please," he replied without looking up. "May we take Uncle Gardiner's letter?" Elizabeth asked. "Take whatever you like and leave me alone," he said. Elizabeth took the letter, and they went upstairs. Mary and Kitty were with Mrs. Bennet, so one explanation would suffice. After a brief introduction, Jane read the letter aloud. Mrs. Bennet could hardly contain herself. As soon as Jane read Mr. Gardiner's hope for Lydia's marriage, Mrs. Bennet's joy erupted. "My dear, dear Lydia," she cried. "She'll be married. I'll see her again. She'll be married at 16. My kind brother, I knew he'd handle everything. I can't wait to see her and dear Wickham. But the wedding clothes, I'll write to my sister Gardiner about them. Lizzie, ask your father how much he'll give for them. No, I'll go myself. Kitty, ring for Hill. I'll get ready immediately. How merry we'll be." Jane tried to calm her by reminding her of Mr. Gardiner's generosity. "We owe this happy outcome to his kindness. He must have pledged money to Mr. Wickham." "Of course," Mrs. Bennet said. "Who else should do it but her uncle? It's the first time we've had anything from him besides presents. I'm so happy. Soon I'll have a married daughter. Mrs. Wickham. It sounds wonderful. Jane, I'm too flustered to write, so I'll dictate and you write for me. We'll discuss the money with your father later. The clothes must be ordered immediately." She began listing fabrics and details, but Jane persuaded her to wait until their father could be consulted. One day's delay wouldn't matter, and Mrs. Bennet, too happy to argue, agreed. Other plans filled her mind. "I'll go to Meryton and tell my sister Phillips the good news. I'll call on Lady Lucas and Mrs. Long too. Kitty, order the carriage. An airing will do me good. Girls, do you need anything from Meryton? Oh, here's Hill. Hill, have you heard the good news? Miss Lydia is getting married. You shall all have a bowl of punch to celebrate." Mrs. Hill expressed her joy, and Elizabeth, overwhelmed by the excitement, retreated to her room to think. Lydia's situation was dire, but it could have been worse. Though rational happiness and prosperity seemed unlikely for her sister, the current relief was significant compared to their recent fears. Chapter 50, Reflections and Resolutions. Mr. Bennet had often, in quieter times, wished he had set aside funds for his daughters and his wife's future. Now, with the family embroiled in scandal due to Lydia's actions, he regretted it more than ever. Had he been more provident, Lydia would not have been reliant on her uncle's generosity to salvage what little dignity they could from her imprudence. Mr. Bennet was deeply troubled that the burden of rectifying Lydia's situation fell entirely upon Mr. Gardiner, and he vowed to repay his brother-in-law as soon as possible. In his younger days, when Mr. Bennet first married, he had dismissed the notion of saving, sure that a son would eventually be born to secure the family's financial future. As the years passed and only daughters graced their home, the idea of a son became a distant dream, and with it the urgency of frugality faded. Now, as Mr. Bennet faced the current family crisis, these past decisions came back to haunt him. He penned a letter of heartfelt thanks to Mr. Gardiner, acknowledging his efforts and expressing a firm intention to fulfill any financial obligations incurred on Lydia's behalf. The thought that Wickham, a man he scorned, would marry Lydia with little inconvenience to Mr. Bennet himself was a bitter pill to swallow. He reflected on how Lydia's upkeep had always been managed within her allowance, a fact that only sharpened his current resolve to manage his finances with more care. He marvelled at the irony that the resolution of this disaster required minimal effort on his part, considering his usual aversion to exertion. The news of Lydia's marriage and the arrangements made spread quickly through the household, bringing a mix of relief and renewed gossip among the neighbourhood. Mrs. Bennet, in particular, revelled in the social stir, already busy planning a grand future for Lydia without considering the realities of her new life in the north. In private, Mr. Bennet firmly told Mrs. Bennet that Lydia and Wickham would not be welcomed at Longbourn. The ensuing argument revealed his absolute refusal to finance any part of Lydia's new household, a decision that shocked Mrs. Bennet, who was more concerned with the appearance of Lydia's marriage than the scandal itself. Elizabeth, amidst these turbulent emotions, regretted having involved Mr. Darcy in their family troubles. She knew his connection to Wickham would make any association with her family distasteful to him. Her feelings for Darcy, once mixed, now grew into a painful regret as she considered what might have been if scandal had not touched her family. As Mr. Bennet awaited further news from London, he resigned himself to the unwelcome task of reintegrating Lydia into the family fold, at the behest of Jane and Elizabeth. They argued that acknowledging Lydia's marriage publicly would mitigate some of the scandal's effects and help restore a semblance of dignity to their sister. In due course, Mr. Gardiner's next letter confirmed that Wickham would leave the militia for a new start in the regular army, a move that would distance him and Lydia from the immediate scandal and perhaps offer them a fresh beginning. Mr. Gardiner's letter outlined plans for Wickham's debts to be settled, and he requested Mr. Bennet's assistance in ensuring all creditors were paid, a task Mr. Bennet accepted with a weary sense of duty. As plans solidified for Lydia and Wickham to visit Longbourn shortly after their wedding, Elizabeth felt a complex mix of relief and apprehension. The thought of seeing Wickham again was unwelcome, yet inevitable. Amidst these reflections, she couldn't help but lament the lost opportunity with Mr. Darcy, whose regard she now valued more than ever, knowing it was likely lost to her forever. Chapter 51. The Wedding Day. The day of Lydia's wedding arrived, and Jane and Elizabeth felt a whirlwind of emotions, probably more than Lydia herself. The carriage was sent to fetch them, and they were to return by dinner time. Jane dreaded their arrival, worried about what Lydia might have endured, and projecting her own feelings of shame onto her sister. The family gathered in the breakfast room to greet them. Mrs. Bennet's face was lit with excitement as the carriage pulled up, while Mr. Bennet maintained his stern demeanour. Jane and Elizabeth were filled with anxiety and unease. Lydia's voice echoed through the vestibule as the door swung open and she rushed into the room. Mrs. Bennet stepped forward, embracing her with joy, and welcomed Wickham with a cheerful smile, showing no doubt of their happiness. Mr. Bennet's reception was far less warm. His face grew more severe and he barely spoke. The young couple's easy confidence was enough to provoke him. Elizabeth was disgusted, and even Jane was shocked. Lydia was unchanged, untamed, loud, and carefree. She demanded congratulations from her sisters, and once seated, eagerly inspected the room, noting any little changes since she had last been there. Wickham, though equally undistressed, maintained his charming demeanour. Elizabeth found it hard to believe his audacity. She resolved to set no limits to the impudence of an impudent man. She and Jane blushed, but the cheeks of those causing their embarrassment remained unchanged. There was no shortage of conversation. Lydia and her mother could hardly talk fast enough, and Wickham, seated near Elizabeth, inquired about their acquaintances with a good-natured ease that she struggled to match. "Just think, it's been 3 months since I left. It feels like only a fortnight. So much has happened," Lydia exclaimed. "When I left, I had no idea I'd be married before coming back, though I did think it would be fun." Mr. Bennet rolled his eyes, Jane looked distressed, and Elizabeth shot Lydia a warning glance. But Lydia, oblivious to any reprimand, continued, "Oh, Mamma, do the people around here know I'm married today? I was afraid they might not, so when we overtook William Goulding in his curricle, I let down the side glass, showed off my ring, and bowed and smiled like anything." Elizabeth could bear it no longer. She left the room and didn't return until she heard them heading to the dining room. She rejoined them just in time to see Lydia take her mother's right hand and tell Jane, "I take your place now, Jane. You must go lower because I'm a married woman." Time did nothing to curb Lydia's lack of embarrassment. Her good spirits grew, and she longed to see Mrs. Phillips, the Lucases, and all their neighbours, eager to be called Mrs. Wickham. After dinner, she flaunted her ring to Mrs. Hill and the housemaids. "Well, Mamma," Lydia said when they returned to the breakfast room, "what do you think of my husband? Isn't he charming? I'm sure my sisters envy me. I hope they have half my luck. They should all go to Brighton. That's where you find husbands. What a pity we didn't all go." "Very true, my dear," replied Mrs. Bennet, "but I don't like the idea of you being so far away. Must it be so?" "Oh, yes, I shall love it. You all must visit us in Newcastle. There will be balls, and I'll get good partners for everyone." "I'd love that," Mrs. Bennet exclaimed. "You could leave one or two of your sisters behind. I'm sure I'll find husbands for them before winter's over." "Thank you, but I don't like your way of finding husbands," Elizabeth replied. The visitors were only staying 10 days. Wickham had received his commission and was to join his regiment in a fortnight. Only Mrs. Bennet regretted their short stay, making the most of it by visiting with Lydia and hosting frequent parties. These gatherings were a welcome distraction, especially for those who preferred to avoid a family circle. Wickham's affection for Lydia was exactly what Elizabeth had expected, not equal to hers. She knew their elopement was driven more by Lydia's love than his. She suspected his circumstances had forced his hand, and he wouldn't pass up an opportunity for a companion. Lydia adored him, calling him her dear Wickham, and believing he was the best at everything. One morning, as Lydia sat with Jane and Elizabeth, she said, "Lizzie, I never told you about my wedding, did I? Aren't you curious?" "No, really," Elizabeth replied. "I think less said about it, the better." "You're so strange, but I must tell you. We were married at St. Clement's because that's where Wickham's lodgings were. We were supposed to be there by 11. My uncle and aunt went with me, and the others met us at the church. Well, Monday morning came, and I was so nervous. Aunt kept talking like she was preaching a sermon, but I only thought about Wickham. I wondered if he'd wear his blue coat. We had breakfast at 10. My uncle and aunt were horrid, no parties, nothing. Then just as the carriage came, my uncle was called away by Mr. Stone. I was terrified because my uncle had to give me away. Luckily, he returned in 10 minutes, and we set out. I realized later that Mr. Darcy could have given me away if my uncle hadn't been there." "Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth repeated, astonished. "Oh, yes, he was to come with Wickham, but I shouldn't have said anything. I promised to keep it secret. What will Wickham say?" "If it's a secret, don't say another word," Jane advised. "Certainly," Elizabeth agreed, though burning with curiosity. "We won't ask." "Thank you. If you did, I'd tell you everything, and Wickham would be furious." Encouraged to ask, Elizabeth restrained herself by leaving the room. She couldn't stand not knowing why Mr. Darcy had attended Lydia's wedding. She quickly wrote a letter to her aunt, seeking an explanation, unless it was to remain secret. She added a postscript. "If you don't tell me, I'll resort to tricks to find out." Jane's sense of honour kept her from discussing what Lydia had revealed, which Elizabeth appreciated. Until she knew more, she preferred not to share her thoughts.